Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a topic today that's, well, a little more complex than you might think at first glance. Emancipation.
Hmm.
We're using a clip from American History Hit today,
Okay.
an interview with Professor Chris Mangapra. He wrote The Black Ghost of Empire, which is a pretty fascinating look at the long history of slavery and the failures of emancipation, really.
Right.
We often think of emancipation as this one event, this moment in time,
Yeah.
but it's really this long and often really messy process.
It really is. And what I find fascinating is that the concept of emancipation itself, it's kind of baked into this power imbalance from the start, you know.
Yeah, that's interesting. So maybe before we even get into specific events,
Yeah.
let's define terms a little bit.
Okay.
What are we even talking about when we say emancipation? What does that really mean?
Well, if you break it down, the word emancipation comes from Latin,
Mm-hmm.
and it means to let free from the hand.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about that, you know, whose hand is opening, whose hand is letting go.
The slave owner.
Yeah, the slave owner, it's their action. It's about their control, not really about the perspective of
Yeah.
the person being emancipated.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really good point. So it's all about the slave owner's actions, but what does that really mean then for freedom, for the people being emancipated? Like, was it truly freedom if they were, still subject to the whims of whoever was in power?
Yeah, and that's the through line we'll see as we go through this history.
Okay.
That emancipation on paper often didn't quite translate to real freedom, to
Yeah.
equality in
Yeah.
practice.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into some examples to really ground this a bit.
Okay.
We tend to think of emancipation in the US, right?
Right.
So let's start there. And I think most people would probably say, it all began with Lincoln and the Civil War, but is that really the beginning of the story?
You know, not really.
Right.
The first kind of modern emancipations in the U.S. they happened way back in the late 18th century.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, and you might be surprised to hear that these first emancipations were actually in the North,
Oh, wow. Okay.
starting in Philadelphia in 1780.
That is surprising. Why the North? I mean, I always thought slavery was much more entrenched in the South.
That's what we tend to think, right?
Yeah.
But you have to remember there were a few things going on in the North. Quaker ideology, which was really opposed to slavery, had a
Eh,
lot of influence in that region.
So this was like a purely moral movement then.
I mean, moral arguments definitely had a part in it,
Yeah.
but there's also the economic side of things. The North was kind of starting to transition right towards industrialization,
Uh,
free trade,
okay.
and those relied on wage labor, not slave labor.
So the old ways of doing things, the plantation system and all that,
Mm-hmm.
was becoming less profitable. Exactly. Yeah. And that economic shift, that really had a huge impact on how emancipation unfolded.
Yeah.
You know, just imagine the tension between those old and new systems, how that played out for enslaved people at the time.
Yeah, totally. So it's not just about the ideals, but it's also about like just economics, right?
Absolutely.
Wow, okay. So you have these early emancipations in the North,
Right.
driven by this mix of morals and economics, but then of course you have the American Revolution happening at the same time,
Right.
which, is all about freedom and liberty in theory.
Mhm.
So I'm guessing things get even more complicated when you throw war into the mix.
Oh, absolutely. It gets pretty ironic when you realize that enslaved people were also fighting for their freedom during the revolution,
Okay.
but on the side of the British.
Wow, that's a twist. So
Mhm.
so the colonists, the people fighting for American independence, they're using slave labor,
Yeah.
while the British, who, we think of as this empire built on slavery,
Right.
they're offering freedom to those who fight for them.
You got it. The British used emancipation as a tactic.
Hmm.
It was a way to weaken the colonists to gain an advantage in the war.
But wasn't that kind of a risky move for the British, though? I mean, weren't they worried about what would happen if they started freeing enslaved people?
It was a calculated risk. They really needed to win the war.
Yeah.
So they saw emancipation as a way to do that.
Okay.
And the long-term consequences, well, those often got overlooked, as we'll see.
Okay, so we're starting to see this pattern here.
Yeah.
Emancipation is not simple.
Not at all.
It's all tied up in power struggles and economics and political maneuvering.
Mhm.
So what happened to the people who fought for the British after the war ended?
Right.
Did they actually get the freedom they were promised?
A lot of them did,
Yeah.
but the reality wasn't what they hoped for. Thousands of them were sent to Nova Scotia, but they were basically abandoned there.
Yeah.
They didn't have support. They didn't have the resources to build new lives.
So they're free in name only, but not in any practical sense. Like they were given this freedom,
Yeah.
but no tools to actually make use of it.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
And that brings us to another key point here.
Hmm.
Emancipation isn't just about declaring freedom, it's about what happens afterward,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Like what resources do they get?
Right.
What support systems are there? How does the power dynamic shift or not shift in this new reality?
You're right. You're right. It's about those actual changes that happen, the follow through, and not just the words, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that actually is a perfect segue to what I wanted to talk about next, which is the Haitian Revolution.
Hmm.
Because here you have enslaved people who don't just fight for their freedom, but they actually win it.
Right.
Like they win it through a full-blown revolution.
Right.
So this feels like a very different kind of emancipation story.
It is, but it also, it still shows how deeply ingrained these power dynamics were.
Yeah.
Because after Haiti wins its independence, France, their former colonizer,
Yeah.
they demand something shocking.
What could they possibly demand after
Reparations.
what?
Not for damages from the war.
Hmm.
They wanted reparations for the loss of their enslaved workforce.
Oh, wow. So essentially Haiti, this nation founded by formerly enslaved people, had to pay for their own freedom.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it?
It is. That's outrageous.
It was a staggering injustice,
Yeah.
and the effect was devastating. The indemnity imposed on Haiti, it crippled their economy for over a century.
Wow. It's incredible how even after a successful revolution,
Right.
the powers that be found a way to kind of, I don't know, still profit
Yeah.
and maintain that control.
Yeah, and the Haitian example really, really underscores a crucial point.
Mhm.
Who truly benefits from these so-called emancipations?
Yeah.
It often wasn't the people being emancipated. It was those who held the power.
That is a very good point. It's this stark reminder that freedom isn't something that's just granted. It's something that you have to constantly fight for, even after it's, supposedly been won.
Hmm.
And speaking of fighting for freedom, I think we need to talk about Britain's role in all of this.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of people think that Britain abolished slavery in 1807,
Right.
but is that really the whole story?
Well, not quite. It is true that in 1807, Britain abolished the slave trade within its empire.
Okay.
But that didn't mean that enslaved people in the British colonies were suddenly free.
Mm.
They were still enslaved for decades after that.
So this was more about stopping the flow of new enslaved people into the empire, not freeing the ones who were already there.
Exactly, yeah. And there's another layer to this that often gets overlooked. When Britain abolished the slave trade, they didn't just, leave the slave owners to figure it out on their own.
What do you mean?
They paid them.
They paid the slave owners.
They did.
What?
They paid them a huge amount of money, like billions of dollars in today's money, to compensate them for their, quote, loss of property.
So they profited for centuries off the backs of enslaved people, and then when they finally ended the trade,
Right.
they paid the slaveholders again.
Yeah, it's pretty baffling when you think about it. And to make matters worse, guess who ended up paying for these payments?
I'm guessing it wasn't the slave owners.
Nope. It was the British taxpayers.
Wow.
And they were still paying off that debt until 2015.
So the financial legacy of slavery really stretched all the way into the 21st century.
It did. And this whole compensation model, it really set a precedent for other European empires.
Hmm.
They saw that Britain had basically rewarded slaveholders for giving up their human property, and they followed suit.
Okay, so we're seeing this trend of prioritizing the interests of the powerful,
Right.
even when it comes to emancipation.
Right.
The slave owners' economic well-being was more important than the actual lives of the people being emancipated.
Yeah, and that mindset, that idea of compensating those who profited from slavery, it continued to influence how emancipation happened in other parts of the world. Even Abraham Lincoln, who we think of as the great emancipator,
Yeah.
he actually considered a compensated emancipation scheme at first.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, he was working within a system that had always put slave owners first, and it took time and the reality is the Civil War to really change that.
Yeah. This is already so much more nuanced than I ever thought. We've only just scratched the surface of the American story, and it's clear that emancipation was not a simple event.
Right.
It was full of compromises and power struggles and honestly a failure to truly deliver on the promise of freedom and equality for all.
That's a really good point. And that failure, it's had a profound impact on history with repercussions that we're still dealing with today. But before we dive into those lasting consequences, I think it's important to look at how emancipation played out in other parts of the world because the story of emancipation is a global one
Yeah.
with its own complexities and challenges in every context.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. It is a global story, and we can't just focus on one part of the world. It's crucial to understand how all these events, even those that happened centuries ago, are still shaping our world today.
Okay, so where should we look next? If we're kind of expanding this view of emancipation globally, what should we focus on?
You mentioned earlier how emancipation often didn't really deliver on the promise of true freedom, of true equality. And I think to really get that, to understand how heavy that statement is, we need to look at the long-term impacts of these incomplete emancipations. A particularly stark example of this is the rise of the prison industrial complex.
The prison industrial complex. Wow, that's a connection I hadn't really thought about before. How does that tie back to emancipation?
Well, think about what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Emancipation a lot of times meant freedom in name only.
Right.
So formerly enslaved people, they were denied basic rights. They couldn't access education, economic opportunities. They were subject to all these discriminatory laws and all those limitations. They created a system where they were always at a disadvantage. And then that disadvantage it was used to justify even more control and exploitation.
So even though slavery ended, it's like the systems of oppression they morphed into something new.
Exactly, yeah. They
Right.
became something more insidious. And the prison industrial complex, with its mass incarceration of mostly black and brown people,
Yeah.
it's a direct result of those systems.
Mm.
You see it in the way people are criminalized for minor things,
Yeah.
trapped in these cycles of poverty and incarceration, denied opportunities to actually build a better life.
It's kind of a bleak picture. I mean, it's almost like these historical injustices, they just keep rippling out,
Yeah.
impacting communities and people today. But I do think it's important to acknowledge the resilience.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, there was so much resistance
Right.
throughout history.
Black individuals and communities, they weren't just, passively accepting whatever was happening. They were fighting for their liberation. They were building their own institutions, creating these vibrant cultures, even while facing so much adversity.
You're right. You're right. It's easy to kind of get caught up in that narrative of just oppression and overlook the incredible strength,
Right.
the agency
Yeah.
that people showed.
And we can't overlook it. We need to highlight those stories of resistance, celebrate what black leaders and communities accomplished, and recognize that this fight for justice and equality, it's still going on.
100%. We need to remember that within all these systems of oppression,
Right.
there were people who defied the odds,
Yeah.
who fought back, who created spaces of joy, of resilience.
Absolutely.
And those stories, they need to be heard.
They do. And that actually brings us to today, right?
Yeah.
To the conversations that are happening around reparations. Reparations movements, they're not new.
Right.
They've been around for centuries, led by black communities who are trying to deal with the unfinished business of emancipation.
Yeah. It does feel like the conversation around reparations has really picked up steam in recent years. Why now? What do you think is driving this renewed focus?
I think there are a few things happening at the same time. First, I think there's just more awareness now
Okay.
of how systemic racism is
Yeah.
and how the legacy of slavery is still impacting us.
Yeah, it's not just about individual acts of racism anymore. It's about acknowledging that the systems themselves,
Right.
they perpetuate inequality.
Exactly. And that shift in understanding, it's led to a demand for solutions that are more comprehensive, not just symbolic gestures.
Yeah.
People are recognizing that true justice, it means not just acknowledging the wrongs of the past, but actually working to repair the harm that was done.
And reparations in their many forms are seen as a way to do that.
Exactly. Reparations aren't just about, financial compensation.
Okay.
Although that's definitely a part of it. It's about acknowledging the injustices, both past and present, and creating real pathways to fix those injustices.
So what might those pathways look like? What are some of the things that reparations movements are asking for today?
The demands, they've been pretty consistent over time.
Okay.
Access to quality education, to affordable housing, healthcare, opportunities to build wealth, political representation.
Mm-hmm.
These are just some of the areas that reparations movements are focusing on.
So it's really about creating a more level playing field,
Mhm.
recognizing that the system we have now is built on this foundation of inequality.
That's a great way to put it. Reparations are about leveling that playing field and making sure everyone has a fair shot at a good life.
Okay, so we're starting to get a clearer picture of what reparations could look like, but I'm sure for someone who's maybe hearing about this for the first time,
Right.
it can feel a bit overwhelming, like how is this even possible?
Sure.
So what would you say to someone who's maybe skeptical of the whole idea of reparations?
Well, I'd ask them to think about it this way. If we all agree that a wrong has been committed and that people are still dealing with the consequences of that wrong,
Yeah.
then don't we have a moral obligation to do something about it?
Well,
Reparations aren't about punishing anyone for the past. They're about building a better future for everybody.
yeah, it's about taking responsibility, right?
Right.
Not about blaming.
Right.
But I'm sure there are also practical concerns. How do you even begin to measure the harm
Right.
that's been done over centuries?
It's a complicated issue.
Uh-huh.
There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But just because it's complicated doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it.
Right.
And explore different solutions. There are experts, economists, historians, legal scholars, community organizers who are all working on this,
Yeah.
trying to develop models, frameworks for how reparations could work.
So it's about bringing all those different perspectives together.
Exactly. It takes a willingness to have these open conversations,
Yeah.
to really challenge our own assumptions and to be open to new ideas.
You're right. It's about approaching this collaboratively
Yeah.
and really being committed to finding solutions that work for everybody. And I think it's important to remember that this isn't just some abstract concept
Right.
or historical event. This is about real people,
Right.
real communities
Absolutely.
who are still dealing with the legacy of slavery.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We have to keep that human element front and center in all of this. And remember, the fight for justice, for equality, it's still happening. It didn't end with emancipation. It continues today in the fight for reparations, for equal rights, for a world where everyone can thrive.
That's really powerful. And speaking of that ongoing fight, I think we need to address a really common misconception about emancipation here in the U.S. A lot of people, they think of the Emancipation Proclamation as the moment when slavery ended.
Right.
But that's not really the whole truth, is it?
You're absolutely right. The Emancipation Proclamation, it was a big step,
Yeah.
but it didn't free all the enslaved people in the U.S. right away.
And that's where Juneteenth comes in, right?
That's right. Juneteenth commemorates June 19th, 1865, when enslaved people in Galveston, Texas, they finally found out they were free.
Okay.
And this was more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation.
Wait, so it took over 2 years for the news of emancipation to reach Texas.
Yeah.
Why?
There are a few theories about that. Some historians believe that slave owners purposely didn't tell them.
Wow.
Others say it was just because of communication problems, or that there weren't enough Union troops in the area to actually enforce the proclamation.
So even though freedom had been declared,
Right.
it was delayed, it was withheld.
Yeah.
And in the end, it depended on the actions of those who wanted to keep things the way they were.
It just goes to show you that freedom is rarely a gift.
Yeah.
You know, it's something you have to fight for.
Yeah.
Something you have to demand,
Mm,
even when it's been legally declared.
yeah. That's pretty sobering. But what's amazing to me is that even with that delay, Juneteenth,
Right.
it became this symbol of hope,
Absolutely.
of perseverance.
It shows you how resilient Black communities are.
Yeah.
Their belief in freedom never wavered.
Hmm.
And it's a celebration of the day that freedom, however delayed it was, finally came.
It's also a reminder, I think,
Yeah.
that the fight for true liberation,
Right.
it's still going on.
It is.
And that slavery's legacy is still with us in so many
It
ways.
is. It is. And that brings us right back to the idea of reparations,
Yeah.
to dealing with the unfinished business of emancipation.
So if someone's listening to this
Yeah.
and they're thinking, okay, I get it, this history is important, but where do I even start with this whole idea of reparations?
Well, okay.
What advice would you give them?
I'd say start by listening to and learning from the people who have been directly impacted by slavery's legacy.
Okay.
Read what Black scholars, activists, community leaders are saying.
Send those voices.
Yes, exactly. Center those voices. And then engage in conversations with people.
Yeah.
Even people who might see things differently than you do. Those conversations, they can be tough.
Yeah.
But they're so important
Yeah.
for building understanding
Yeah.
and finding common ground.
Yeah.
And don't underestimate the power of small actions.
Right.
Support organizations that are fighting for racial justice, for reparations. Volunteer, donate, share their message.
And just talk to people.
Yeah, talk to your friends, your family,
Yeah.
your colleagues about these issues.
Share what you've learned.
Yeah, exactly.
Challenge those assumptions.
Yeah.
And just create space for dialogue.
You know, sometimes the things that have the biggest impact are the things we do in our everyday lives. Be mindful of the words you use, the assumptions you make, the way you interact with the world.
Yeah.
Little changes in our own behavior.
Yeah.
They can have a ripple effect. We can build a more just and equitable society, little by little.
That's a great point. It's not always about these big sweeping things.
Right.
It's about how we show up every day.
Exactly.
And the impact we have on the people around us.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey through this history. And I think we often have this very simplified idea of history in our heads. You know, and emancipation, especially, it's often presented as this neat little ending. But as we've seen, it was anything but.
Right. It was messy and complicated and often really unjust. And I think it's so important for us to understand that complexity because it helps us make sense of the world we live in today.
Absolutely. We can't just ignore this history, pretend it doesn't affect us anymore. It's woven into everything, our society, our institutions, how we even understand freedom and equality.
You know, as we wrap up this deep dive, I realize we haven't really talked about what freedom actually means.
Yeah.
We've discussed all the limitations, the ways it was incomplete, how it was manipulated, withheld, but what about freedom itself?
That's such a good point. We've been so focused on the historical and political side of things,
Right.
that we haven't really dug into what it means to actually be free.
Yeah.
On a personal level. What do you think? How would you define freedom?
Oh, that's a tough one. Philosophers have been trying to answer that for centuries, but I think at its core, freedom is about agency.
Okay.
It's about having the power and the resources to shape your own life, your own destiny, to make choices that are in line with your values,
Yeah.
your hopes.
Yeah, I like that. It's not just about the absence of barriers,
Yeah.
but the presence of possibilities.
Right.
The opportunity to live a life that has meaning.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's why this whole conversation about reparations is so important. It's not just about fixing past wrongs. It's about creating a future where everyone has the freedom to thrive, to really reach their potential, to
Yeah.
contribute to society in meaningful ways.
So if that's the future we want, that vision of true freedom, equality,
Right.
where do we go from here? What can we do as individuals?
Well, I think, as we've been saying, education is key. Don't stop learning.
Yeah.
Keep exploring these histories.
Keep asking questions.
Keep
Yeah.
asking questions. Yeah. And challenge your own assumptions.
There's so much to learn. And luckily, there are so many resources out there these days.
Right.
Books, articles, documentaries, podcasts. There's a ton of information out there.
And don't just, passively absorb it. Think about it critically.
Right.
Ask those questions. Look for different perspectives. Challenge the narratives that you've been given.
Be an active participant in the learning process, not just a passive listener.
Exactly.
Okay, so you've started to build this foundation of knowledge.
Yeah.
What do you do with it?
Well, knowledge without action doesn't really do much.
Right.
So find ways to put that knowledge into practice. Support those organizations that are working for racial justice, for reparations. Volunteer your time, donate, share their message.
And talk to people.
Yes, talk to people. Have those conversations.
Have those tough conversations.
Yes, even if they're tough.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes the most powerful actions are the ones we take in our daily lives. Just be aware of the language you use, the assumptions you're making, how you interact with the world around you.
It's those small changes that can really add up.
They can, they can. And I think that's a good note to end on. We've talked about a lot, but this is really just the start of the conversation. The history is emancipation. With all its twists and turns, it's still shaping our world today. And it's up to all of us to really wrestle with that legacy, to learn from it, and to work towards a future where freedom and equality are real for everyone.
I love that. Thank you so much for walking us through this really fascinating and sometimes really difficult exploration of emancipation. And to all of you listening, I hope this has made you curious. I hope it's inspired you to keep learning, to keep engaging with this really crucial conversation. Remember, history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's a living thing that shapes who we are today and who we'll be tomorrow. So keep asking those questions, keep challenging those assumptions, and keep fighting for a world where everyone has the chance to truly thrive.
Yeah.